Are you thinking about setting up a continuous enrollment contract or agreement for this upcoming year, or have you already used one in the past? Regardless of where you stand, I'm hoping this session will give you some tips on how to approach the process or improve your existing one. So, first of all, let's talk about the benefits of continuous enrollment. So first of all, it helps improve client satisfaction because what you're doing is you're basically simplifying the initial enrollment and the re-enrollment process. You're letting families know the first year you're going to read through an entire agreement, sign off on all the respective clauses, become familiar with our policies. But when you go to re-enroll, it's going to be a much simpler process, a simple CEA addendum that you'll just sign off on each and every year. The second benefit is that you're going to potentially boost retention because what you're doing psychologically is you're emphasizing a long-term commitment to the family. You're saying, you know what, we don't care just about next year. We really are concerned about your son or daughter's full elementary school or middle school or high school education. So you want to make sure that you're really ensuring that it's a long-term psychological process for families. The third thing that it does is potentially it can improve, your cash flow. It can decrease your customer service calls, and it can create a lot of new efficiencies. If your admission office and your business office is being inundated by lots of calls centering around re-enrollment every year, you want to drive that activity downward and so that you can really focus on your new enrollments. The second thing I'd really like to talk about is how to approach this process. So let's say you don't have a continuous enrollment a contract in place yet. Let's work backwards. Let's first think about how you would communicate about a CEA before you even start to adjust your core contract. This will help you really think about making the contract user-friendly for families and really have it make sense to them. So you might just start out just drafting a simple letter with the key information and instructions and think about it from a family's perspective and really cite some of the benefits of the continuous enrollment agreement. Because they're going to want to know, why are you making this change? How does it help me? And sometimes parents do complain. They don't like lengthy registration process and these events that go on and on when they first enroll their child, or reading these lengthy contracts every year. So anything we can do to improve that customer service orientation is going to serve you well. It's going to improve your reputation, and it's going to demonstrate that you really care about families and their time. So let's think about some of the common questions families might ask. So let's say they've filled out the core contract the first year, but then they are going to re-enroll the second year. So they're going to be asking, well, how do I re-enroll? What if I decide to disenroll? How can I check my status if I've signed a CEA? I want to make sure that my re-enrollment went through. What if I'm unsure about whether I will be enrolling my child? How much time do I have? Is there a hard deadline? What is the first payment or deposit, and when is it due? What do I do if I want to wait until I get my financial aid award and I won't know until after this deadline that you are citing? What if I'm uncertain about re-enrollment and I happen to miss the deadline, or I can't make the deadline? How are tuition and fee changes adjusted? And last but not least, how do I terminate the CEA agreement? So think about each and every one of those questions and make sure that in the core document, you address that at the very front end. So you put their concerns at bay and you really can move into the core document and get their sign off. Now, let's talk about critical clauses for enrollment contracts in general. So your main continuous enrollment contract for new students should be carefully organized in sections and cover all of the information that I'm about to cover. But the CEA addendum, like I mentioned before, is really for only returning students, and it should be quite brief. It's just a few clauses where they quickly read it over and sign it off. And then they pull out their core main contract if they want to review that as well. But the whole point is that they don't need to initial every clause every year or read the full contract on a yearly basis if they don't feel the need to do so. So the main contract for new students should definitely include information like academic and behavioral expectations, reasons that you would dismiss or how students follow a withdrawal process, a full disclosure of your costs, including tuition, room, board, incidentals, and fees. If you have addendums that you add, fee schedules, tuition schedules, those can be in the form of attachments, but they should be carefully embedded in that core contract, not be all these ancillary supplements that people receive. Otherwise, it won't be legally binding. Refund policies, very, very important on your policies, procedures, and legal protections. A force majeure clause. This came up in the last couple of years, and all schools really need to make sure that they cover all potential disasters that could interrupt your core operations. Health policies, very, very important. One of the main reasons why registration day events used to be so cumbersome was because the health department or the health center, excuse me, would often want to, check all of the documents and check everyone in. And that would be a very time-consuming process for parents and for that department. But most schools now have really moved registration events to an online process. And I encourage you to really think about doing so, because if you think about how time is utilized on registration day events, it's primarily getting academic schedules lined up with electives. It's going through your health center's protocols, making sure all the vaccinations, the medications are taken in properly, all the sign-offs and documents are completed. And then, a lot of the other things are, checking in with athletics or checking in with campus life, maybe, checking in with, the business office and paying bills. But there's no reason why all those things really cannot be handled in advance. Of course, you'd also want to include the fiscal responsibility of parties involved and repercussions for any non-payment. And then the impact of any non-disclosures or incorrect information and the consequences. I have seen schools in real binds because maybe they don't ask for information centering around learning differences, like an IEP, for instance, or learning plans and IEPs and things like that. Maybe they don't ask for legal documents. Maybe they don't ask for critical information about psychological information. So you've really got to be careful that if somebody has signed off that on a clause that you have in your contract and they supplied incorrect information, that you have the ability to withdraw that student if necessary. As a private school, you're not indicating that you can accommodate any and all situations, but do check with your attorney. Some attorneys advise that you do request IEPs. Some advise against it because they feel that you are at risk for lawsuits. Some attorneys strongly advise to ask about psychological and emotional situations and have therapists or practitioners do a sign off, but others do not. So make sure you're really clear on what your policies and protocols are. I really want to emphasize the need for a force majeure clause, as I mentioned earlier. I'm not going to give you necessarily an example, but I'm going to give you information on exactly what you need to include. So you would want to list the kinds of events beyond your school's control. For instance, natural disasters such as tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, wildfires, pandemics, cyber attacks, terrorism, wars, campus fires, and governmental actions. Maybe I'm excluding something there, but make sure it is inclusive. Obligations may be suspended, changed, or modified immediately due to force majeure causes or issues. Timing depends on when it is safe or wise or prudent to resume campus operations. So don't put yourself in a corner by saying exactly when things are going to get back to normal, so to speak. Service delivery. How are you going to deliver services? Well, many schools are now prepared to provide distance learning, synchronous or asynchronous virtual methods, remote and distance learning. Keep in mind, you need to say something about that educational service delivery and what it implies about refunds. So if you have a specific policy on tuition, boarding, and fees, you need to state that, or you say it does not imply tuition refunds. So in the case of a specific incident, you may want to consult with your board of trustees before you make a final determination about refunds. So if you need that kind of an allowance, you would want to say something like, we will make a final determination on room, books, uniforms, laundry, incidentals, international insurance fees, and special programs based on a fair and final determination as approved by our school head and the board of trustees. That still covers you, but it doesn't, once again, put you in a box, because you may find a school fire that's isolated is very different than a pandemic. So you may want to take situations on a case-by-case basis. And then last but not least, consider a clause allowing parents to apply any credits or balance towards the next school year, or directing funds to assist families in need. Now, many institutions, including higher ed, none of us are prepared to give everybody their money back and then ask for funds back. So most schools and colleges, they just applied credits and balances towards upcoming school years. And many schools did a really good job of PR by saying, if you would like to direct your funds that you have in your account towards families that are currently in need, you can certainly opt to do so. But make sure you have protocols in place for how that's going to be handled. You have to be very clear on, fundraising, financial assistance, and the redirection of tuition funds to other families. So that requires your business office, your CFO, your president, probably your board of trustees, and even your legal arm to carefully vet that. Now, you also want to make sure that you have a real clear plan for releasing your CEA and the key deadlines. And I noticed that some schools really wait until late in the fall or even in the winter before they pin down their contract drafts, their deadlines. But it's really wise to have all of this set up in the early fall and really know what your calendar is going to be, not only for contract releases, but for all of the communications that reinforce and help inform your families. And so make sure that, you send the full contract to new and then the abbreviated CEA addendum to returning students, and that you have specific dates set for that process. Now, I will share that in working with clients nationwide, private boarding and day schools tend to really vary in terms of their releases. But some of the better schools and the stronger schools that have full enrollment plus waitlist tend to release early in January or February, sometimes in March. But top schools, what they are doing is they're imposing those tight timelines. They're getting all of their applications in the fall. They're reviewing them, and then they're releasing their contracts. They're locking in their enrollment. And what they're doing from there then is building their wait list, so that if they do have any fallout, they can quickly and easily pull the best of the best from their wait list. So not all schools are in that category, and many schools now are rolling through the late spring and summer in an effort to fill their spaces. But believe me, psychologically, when you say that you are at capacity with a wait list, that creates a psychological feeling of limited demand or limited supply, excuse me. High demand, limited supply. So to accelerate contract submissions, I want to encourage you to think about the incentives that you provide. So you may not, have the benefit of, being at full capacity with a wait list by the early spring or even early summer. So how are you going to build in incentives? Are you going to offer an early bird tuition discount against your first deadline? Are you going to offer uniform or book discounts, or even bookstore credits in an effort to get families to get their contracts in by the deadline that you impose? Otherwise, you are just rolling after that, and psychologically, parents see that they've missed the deadline, but oh well, I can just kind of enroll whenever I like. Um, so make sure your timelines are very clear on your website. Make sure that you're very clear about the CEA deadline and re-enrollment addendums, your financial aid deadlines, registration day events, and the date of the first classes. All of that needs to be orchestrated very carefully by the Office of Admission in sync with, other departments campus-wide. But you really need to work backwards from the first day of classes to your registration, and then make sure that your contracts and financial aid deadlines are in sync. I really do encourage you to avoid pitfalls by making sure that your CEA is carefully reviewed and vetted. Make sure departments read it over, the full contract every year. Make sure your CEA addendum clauses are tightened up, and make sure you review the core information with your executive office, and that you gain the necessary approvals on what you have in that document. And then always ask your attorney to review any contracts or agreements or addendums after the draft has been completed and reviewed departmentally. And follow this practice every year, even for minor modifications, and do it early to avoid delayed releases. I know that your board may assist in the setting of tuition and sometimes even fees. So it's very important to encourage your board of trustees to establish tuition changes very early in the process. I recommend every summer, or at the latest, very early fall for tuition setting. And then fees should be done at the same exact time. And typically presidents or heads have the opportunity to review those and sign off on those. And then in terms of technologies, really think about the most efficient way to release your contracts and CEA addendums. Some of you have CRMs. That can be a very effective method. Some schools are using a DocuSign method for just the addendums, but then they're using their CRM for their core CEA main contract. Maybe, you're doing it by email or maybe even hard copy mailings. I know some schools are still mailing out contracts every year. But believe me, electronic signatures in most states are now considered legal and binding, but ensure that you check with your attorney on that and that you're following the exact protocols. Um, Also, really make sure that you reinforce core information on your website, your email newsletters, and through personal contact calls. You will save so much frustration and really help with client service if families feel like you've reached out to them personally to address their questions. So if you need any help in editing or reviewing contracts or your CEA or any of the clauses, feel free to reach out to Aperture Advisory Associates. We're here to help, and we offer a free advisory session to assist you with any questions you might have about CEA or contracts and agreements. Thank you so much. I hope that was helpful.